The toast was supposed to be the final moment, the one that tied everything together. After months of planning, thousands of dollars, and every ounce of patience I had left, I stood at the back of the reception hall, champagne in hand, watching him walk to the microphone. My dress felt too tight, not because of the fit, but because of the weight in my chest. He smiled at the crowd, his coworkers, childhood friends, and a handful of distant cousins I had flown in from 3 different cities. I expected something simple, a thank you, maybe an acknowledgement. Instead, he raised his glass high and said, "To my real family, the people who stood by me no matter what. You know who you are." Laughter followed clinks of glasses. Cheers. But I stood frozen, the glass trembling between my fingers. My name was never said, not even implied. No look in my direction, no nod, just a line that cut me out of the picture I helped frame. I looked around the room waiting for someone to glance my way, to register the cruelty of it. No one did. They were too busy celebrating a man who had just erased the person who paid for the very table they were sitting at. I smiled, thin and mechanical, and took a sip, the bubbles scratching my throat. I thought back to the credit cards, the emails, the late-night calls to vendors. I thought back to the suit he's wearing, tailored with the last bit of my savings. And I thought, maybe this toast isn't the end of something. Maybe it's the beginning of me waking up. I stood there for the rest of his speech, clapping. When everyone else clapped, smiling just enough to not raise questions. But inside, something was shifting quietly, like a hairline crack stretching through glass. I had rehearsed this day in my mind for months. Not just the seating charts, the color schemes, the playlist, but the feeling. I thought I'd feel proud, chosen, secure. Instead, I felt like a placeholder at my own celebration. When he stepped off the stage, he kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "You okay?" As if he hadn't just cut me out with a single sentence. Of course, I said, because that's what I'd always said. Of course I'm okay. Of course I'll cover that cost. Of course I'll handle it. I watched him walk back into the crowd. Arms around 2 of his cousins, the same ones who once told him I wasn't the right kind of woman for their family. They had criticized everything about me, from my job, to my laugh, to the fact that I never needed anything from them. But tonight, they were his real family. I set my glass down on the table and walked outside, heels clicking softly against the marble. The night air was cold, crisp, honest. I leaned against the stone railing and stared at the sky, unsure if I was trying to calm myself or hold myself. Together, one thought kept circling in my mind. Soft but relentless. If this is what love looks like when it's repaid, what exactly did I just buy with everything I had? I stayed outside longer than I intended, letting the chill settle into my arms, numbness preferable to the heat of humiliation. From where I stood, I could hear the muffled thump of music, glasses clinking, the occasional burst of laughter. My wedding, my bill, their party. I thought of the way he had looked at me just hours earlier, in the hotel room, nervously adjusting. "His cufflinks you saved this day," he had said. "None of this would have happened without you," but apparently none of it was worth saying out loud when it counted. I wasn't asking to be the center of attention I never had. I only ever wanted to be seen as a partner, not a purse. I had believed that covering the cost was an investment in our future. But now, standing there with mascara dried stiff beneath my eyes, I realized I'd been financing an illusion. One where my value was always in what I could provide, not in who I was. The first warning sign should have been when his mother never thanked me for paying off the venue. The second, when he didn't correct his uncle, who assumed his side of the family had taken care of everything. But I had brushed it all aside because love is supposed to be patient, right? Love is supposed to give without keeping score. But I had kept score that night, not out of pettiness, but out of survival. Because something in me needed proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling invisible in a room I had built from the ground up. And as the night dragged on, that list just kept growing. The next morning, I woke up before him. The suite was still dark, the expensive linens tangled around his legs like nothing had happened. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching from the day before, just from exhaustion, but from carrying a truth I hadn't spoken aloud. I walked barefoot to the other room where the gift bags sat untouched, lined up neatly for the guests we had thanked more than each other. I looked around at the remnants of a celebration that felt like it belonged to someone else. The champagne flutes, the handwritten place cards I had stayed up folding until my fingers cramped. The floral arrangements I personally negotiated down. To fit the budget, everything down to the last ribbon had passed through my hands, and yet none of it had passed through his heart. I sat at the edge of the couch and stared at my phone, scrolling through messages from people saying how beautiful everything was and what a perfect night. I typed thank yous. I didn't mean out of habit, out of fear that if I didn't respond, someone might ask how I really felt. I glanced back at the bedroom where he slept peacefully, unaware. And I thought, how do you share a life with someone who doesn't even notice when he's left you out of his most public words? A part of me hoped he'd wake up and say anything that acknowledged the emptiness in the room. But when he stirred, all he asked was, "Do we have time for breakfast before checkout?" And in that moment, I realized I was already checked out. We ate breakfast downstairs in silence. He scrolled through his phone between bites, laughing at a meme his cousin had sent while I stirred my coffee without drinking it. The waiter congratulated us twice. I smiled both times, a rehearsed flick of the mouth that didn't reach my eyes. He didn't notice. He was too busy talking about where we should hang the framed photo his best friend gave us. "It's so us," he said. I glanced at it later. It was a drawing of him with his groomsmen. I wasn't in it. And somehow that felt fitting. I had begun to understand something I never wanted to admit. I had married a man who loved being celebrated, not challenged. Someone who adored what I made possible, but never truly saw the one making it. And worse, I had taught him that was okay. I had said yes to every expense, every compromise, every silence, because I believed it would buy me safety, belonging, permanence. But money doesn't purchase respect, and love built on silence eventually collapses under its own weight. After breakfast, we returned to the suite, packed in awkward quiet, like two people who had hosted the same event but remembered it completely differently. As I zipped my suitcase shut, I paused, not because I wasn't ready, but because I realized I had been packing for longer than I thought. In my mind, in my heart, in the small ways I'd stopped expecting to be chosen. I had become so good at managing disappointment that I forgot it wasn't normal, and somewhere between the ceremony and the toast, I had finally remembered what normal should feel like. When we got home, the house felt unfamiliar, like someone else's version of our life had been set down inside mine. There were wedding gifts stacked by the door, glittering cards from people who had praised him all night. "You've got yourself a good one card read. I stood there staring at it, wondering how many times a woman has read those same words after building the entire foundation herself. He went upstairs to shower while I unpacked alone in the kitchen. The bouquet I had caught by default. No one else had reached for it, sat wilting on the counter. I looked at it and realized how symbolic that moment had been, an unwanted gesture passed to the person already carrying everything. I opened the fridge, saw the meal prep I had done days before the wedding so we wouldn't have to worry after the chaos. Every detail had been accounted for, every moment managed by me, and now I couldn't remember the last time he had asked me how I was really doing without needing something in return. I leaned against the counter, breathing slow, wondering how I had become this person, the one who keeps everything together but gets left out of the final picture. Not even out of cruelty, but because somewhere along the line, I had made myself easy to overlook. I closed my eyes and thought, this is not what forever is supposed to feel like. Not like quiet disappointment, not like holding your breath in your own home, and definitely not like watching the person you chose. Toast to everyone, but you. The day after we returned, I called my bank and requested a full printout of the past 6 months of transactions. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I needed to see the numbers lined up on paper, to confirm I wasn't imagining how much of myself I had poured into that wedding. Venue deposit, photographer, custom suit, catering upgrades, floral arrangements, his ring, even the hotel rooms for his family. Almost every major charge had my name on it. I stared at the total, jaw tight, stomach hollow. That number wasn't just financial, it was emotional. It was hours I couldn't get back. Choices I'd postponed. A future I had quietly reshaped around the idea of us, while he gave speeches to everyone else. I printed the list, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer, not to confront him with it, but to remind myself that my memory wasn't lying. Because gaslighting doesn't always come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it arrives, dressed in gratitude, just shallow enough to pacify you while never daring to say your name in the light. I sat at the dining table, the one I had refinished with my own hands, and wrote a letter to myself. Not a dramatic declaration, just a quiet reclaiming. You showed up. You gave fully. You were there even when he didn't see you. I read it aloud. Not for effect, but for evidence. And for the first time, I started to believe it. I wasn't bitter. I was awake. And waking up, I was learning, is far lonelier than people admit, but it's the first step toward freedom. That night, I sat on the couch while he watched something. On TV, some crime drama he loved, the kind where everything is black and white, wrong and right. I wasn't watching, I was observing him, how relaxed he looked, how unaware. He reached for my hand once, casually, like it belonged to the room more than to me. I let him hold it, but I didn't squeeze back, because I realized something in that moment. He didn't notice the difference. He didn't feel the silence growing between us, the shift in weight. To him, Everything was fine. The wedding had gone well, the guests were happy, the photos would be beautiful. I had given him the image he wanted, and he believed that was enough. But images fade. Polished speeches get buried beneath everyday life. And when the applause ends, all that remains is the truth of how someone makes you feel in the quiet. I sat there and asked myself, can I live the rest of my life only being valued in hindsight? Can I spend years being everything behind the curtain while he continues to thank the spotlight? I looked down at our hands, still touching, but not connected, and gently pulled mine away. He didn't react, just kept watching. And in that moment, the answer was clear. I had not been chosen, I had been convenient. There's a difference, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and sat alone with a glass of water, letting that truth settle not like a wound, but like a mirror. Finally cleaned out the following morning, I took a walk alone before he even woke up. I left a note on the counter, just went out for air, but part of me hoped he'd notice. The way the handwriting had changed? Not angry, just distant. The streets were quiet, washed in soft morning light, and I walked without a destination. Just movement, just breath. I passed a cafe we used to love when we first met, when things were simple and new, when he still asked me what I was dreaming about, not just what needed to be done. I thought about those early days often, not because I missed them, but because they reminded me I hadn't always felt this invisible. Somewhere along the way, I started measuring my value in outcomes, how well I could host, support, finance, fix, and he adapted easily. I sat on a bench across from the bakery and watched a young couple laugh, their hands full of pastries and possibility. I wasn't jealous, I was aware of how much of myself I had compromised for a version of love that was always slightly out of reach. I pulled out my phone and opened the note I had started the day after the wedding. At the top it read, what I paid for. Below it I added his suit, his family's plane tickets, his silence. Then, after a long pause, I typed, my place at that table, and just like that, I knew. That seat wasn't mine anymore. It never truly was. And maybe now, for the first time, I was ready to find a table where I didn't have to pay to be invited. That afternoon I started packing a small bag, not to leave for good not yet, but to create space between what I'd built and what I no longer believed in. I folded clothes slowly, like each one held a different version of me. The dress I wore to his friend's engagement party, where they joked about me being the sugar planner. The sweatshirt I wore the day we signed the venue contract. My hands trembling after transferring money I didn't really have to spare. I packed quietly, intentionally, choosing only what belonged to me, not what I had bought for us. In the bottom drawer, I found the envelope where I had kept all the receipts. I had saved them thinking I'd need them for records. Now, I saw them for what they really were. A paper trail of a woman trying to earn permanence through effort. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But there was something sobering about finally acknowledging that I couldn't keep building a life where I had to fund my own worth. When he came home, I told him I'd be staying at a friend's for a while. He blinked, confused, then said, "Is this about the toast?" That was all he saw. One moment. One sentence. Not the pattern, not the accumulation, not the quiet hunger to be seen. I looked at him. Really looked. Tan said, "It's about everything that made that sentence feel expected." He didn't follow me to the door, didn't ask what I needed, and as I stepped outside, I realized that sometimes the absence of resistance is the clearest form of release. I stayed with a friend who didn't ask too many questions. She simply opened the door, handed me a spare key, and said, "The couch is yours for as long as you need it." There was no unpacking, no explaining, just quiet, kindness, space. At night, we drank tea and watched old movies. During the day, I worked remotely from her kitchen table, my fingers steady, my breath even. It was the first time in weeks I felt like I could think without performing. I didn't tell many people I'd left. I wasn't ready for their advice or their pity. What I needed most was to hear myself again, without the echo of his voice filtering. Everything I thought, I journaled each morning, sometimes only a sentence, sometimes several pages. I wrote about the toast, the silence, the look on his face when I said I needed space, but mostly I wrote about the woman I had been before I lost my place at my own table. I remembered her laughter, her independence, the way she used to walk into a room without shrinking, and slowly, word by word, I began to rebuild her. Not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a return, a homecoming. One evening, while folding laundry, I whispered aloud, "I didn't deserve that." It was the first time I said it without a tremble, and the truth of it landed, not as anger but as peace. Because naming harm isn't the same as holding on to it. Sometimes it's the only way to finally put it down. A week later, he texted me, not to ask how I was, but to let me know that a few of his relatives were asking questions and that it might be better if I cleared the air. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of what had cracked open between us, just image management. I stared at the message for a long time, letting its weight press against the part of me that used to rush in and fix things. That part that would have called each person, explained the silence, softened the truth for their comfort. But not this time. This time I let the message sit unanswered. I wasn't angry, I was simply done carrying the consequences of someone else's choices. That evening, I wrote myself a different kind of letter, not to be sent, but to be remembered. It began with one sentence: "You don't need to be misunderstood to protect their version of the story." I lit a candle and read it aloud, the words falling like small absolutions. I wasn't bitter, I was clear. And in that clarity, I felt something new, the quiet beginning of self-rest. I looked around my friend's living room, modest, lived in, warm, and realized I felt safer here than I had in my own home for months. Not because of the furniture or the walls, but because no one here needed me to disappear in order to feel secure. I had made space for everyone but myself for so long. And now, for the first time, I was filling that space with something honest. Not perfection, not approval, just truth. I didn't go back. Not after a week. Not after 2. He didn't ask me to. He sent occasional updates about the house, about mutual friends, but never once asked what I needed. And that was my answer. Healing doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it arrives in the form of silence that confirms what you already knew. I found a small studio apartment 3 neighborhoods away. It wasn't much, bare walls, creaky floors, secondhand everything, but it was mine. Every decision inside it came from me. The rug I chose because it made me feel grounded. The mug I bought because I liked how it felt in my hand, not because it matched a set. One morning, as sunlight filled the window, I sat at the tiny kitchen table with tea and read through the letter I had written myself weeks earlier. I added one line at the bottom: "You paid for more than a wedding. You paid attention, and that was your gift. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of it." I didn't regret the money. I didn't regret the giving. What I let go of was the belief that love should come without boundaries. That if I just gave enough, I'd finally be named, toasted, claimed. I had learned the hard way that generosity, without recognition, becomes erasure. And now, with my name on the lease, my fingerprints on every surface, I wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. I had already chosen myself, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I started rebuilding slowly. I reconnected with friends I had distanced myself from during the wedding chaos. The ones who had quietly stepped back when they saw me slipping into someone else's shadow. One of them, Ava, invited me to a small dinner with a few women. She thought I almost said no. But something inside me whispered, go. Not because you're ready, but because you're allowed to be seen. That night, we sat around a candlelit table sharing stories. Not just the polished kind, but the messy, honest ones. No one interrupted, no one corrected. They listened like my voice mattered. I told them about the wedding, about the toast, about the silence that followed. And when I said, he raised his glass to his real family, and I wasn't even in the room anymore, one of the women reached across the table and said, "That says everything about him, not you." I nodded, and for the first time, I believed it. Not just intellectually, in my body, in my bones. I walked home that night under soft streetlights, not lighter, but steadier. Healing wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small, quiet choices: to speak, to stay, to leave, to begin. When I got home, I wrote another letter. This one started with, "Dear woman I used to be," and I promised her this: I would never again sit at a table where I had to buy my seat, beg for a mention, or shrink to fit in someone else's toast. I would only sit where I was named with love. Weeks turned into months, and slowly I stopped counting how long it had been since I left. I stopped wondering what he told people, whether he rewrote the story, whether they believed it, because the more distance I created, the clearer everything became. I had funded more than a wedding. I had funded a dynamic that rewarded my silence and called it love, and I was done paying interest on that lie. One quiet Sunday, I visited a local bookstore and bought myself a simple gold bracelet, not flashy, not sentimental, just something I chose for no one but me. On the inside, it had a single word etched: enough. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the lights low and the window open, letting the air move through every room I now called mine. I looked around and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally no longer waiting to be invited into my own life. I lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and raised it not to anyone else, not to a crowd, not for show, just for me. And I whispered to the woman who paid for everything, and finally stopped asking for change. I took a sip, felt the warmth in my chest, and knew with certainty I hadn't lost anything that loved me back. I had only lost what needed me invisible. Have you ever been left out of someone's celebration after building it with your own hands?